Every day, we are learning more about our changing world. Every day, ideas are born, challenges become opportunities. To achieve our purpose, we need people who can turn ideas into reality, who can create success. That's us at ABB. Thinkers, engineers, scientists, innovators. We push the boundaries of technology to make industry safer, more intelligent, and more productive.
Good morning. My name is Mitch Hooke. I'm here today in my capacity as Chairman of Partners in Performance. Most of you will recall that I was the CEO of the Minerals Council of Australia from 2000 until I retired in 2013. This morning we have a very special guest, Steve McIntosh. I'm not going to try and describe his title when he announced his retirement in July and stepped down in his role at Rio Tinto in the end of September, because that's going to become obvious as we go through. And I'm also going to take you through his CV in point form, because it's very impressive, but I want to try and relate that to what we're going to talk about today. So Steve started his career in Papua New Guinea with Kennecott in 1987. Kennecott, for those of you who know, was a wholly owned subsidiary of the amalgam of companies that became Rio Tinto. He worked on the Tabar Group exploration project up there in the Highlands, and we'll come back to his experiences in that area later on when we get into it. He moved to the UK in late 1992. He was part of RTZ's European Project Generation Group. Critically, in that he worked across Europe, the Eastern Bloc, and the former Soviet Union and Africa. After a stint in South Africa, he came back to lead the exploration teams in the UK. 2004, he worked directly with Tom Albanese and then Lee Clifford, of course, as the CEO at the time, and Sir Leon Davis, who was Chem. It's also very important to note that. Came back to Australia in the late 2006, and he became Rio Tinto's head of global exploration. And then in 2016, he basically took on just about everything that you could imagine. He became the group executive for growth and innovation, health, safety, and the environment, which covered the industrial operational technologies, automation innovation, consulting, analytics, the productivity automation, the center of excellence, the strategic production planning, intellectual property, and commercial strategy. This was the man for just about every occasion and every circumstance. He's worked across 5 countries, lived in 5 countries, I should say, worked across more than 45. He's visited more than 100 on businesses. This is quintessentially the experienced man. But let's just take it back and unpick it. So when he joined the industry, it was on the back of the boom of the 70s, the last time we had a boom. And he went through that period where the industry was struggling for productivity gains and passing those on to their customers in the form of lower costs. Then he became involved and being right in London, smack in the middle of the industry's remarkable transformation when it essentially committed to sustainable development. And now, at the end of his career, he's immersed in what is yet the next remarkable transformation of digitization. So Steve, welcome. And thank you so much for agreeing to being part of this process.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Great to be able to join you today.
Let me start with just asking you quite simply, what was it like to be part of that remarkable transformation, and particularly focusing on the area or the time when the industry was at real risk of losing its social license to operate? It was struggling to gain productivity and convert that into a real endowment, a societal wealth from the legitimate development of our natural endowment. We were facing massive contests with our local communities. We'd just been through the divisive debates with Indigenous peoples. What was a time to be part of the leadership, which was so obvious from Rio Tinto, the likes of Sir Robert Wilson and Leon Davis here in Australia? You were smack in the middle of that.
Well, maybe if I just go back to that beginning to start with, Mitch, having joined Kennecott in 1987, working in Papua New Guinea, So as you say, working as an explorationist at the time, two gold discoveries, one Simberi on the Tabar group, the other one Lahire, and seeing those go from, just essentially discovery through evaluation, through to completion of feasibility studies, and also doing work right across Papua New Guinea from the tippity top of the highlands to the islands. And they were really, foundational moments, for my career. I describe it as the perfect apprenticeship, because I got to do everything. I got to see everything. You're really out at the end of supply lines, but we were engaging daily, with communities, and as I've said to you before, masterclass nearly every day, in terms of an education about what you need to get right. In terms of the engagement that you have with your host communities and government and otherwise. And sitting in the background, I think it's important to say, 1989, 1990, what was going on at Bougainville at the time. So Kennecott, at that point, was a subsidiary of British Petroleum, but in 1989, RTZ bought British Petroleum's Minerals Division. And hence, that's how I ultimately came into the Rio Tinto group. But we were clearly being deeply informed by what was happening, literally just down the road from Lahire at Bougainville. And so very clearly, that engagement with communities was absolutely critical to the future development, both of what are today, the Simberi and Lahire gold operations in PNG. I then moved to the UK at the end of 1992, and as you say, it was a privileged time, and got to observe those people, running the company. Sir Bob, the other, Bob, as they used to be called, the two Bobs who really ran the business side of the company. Leon came in during that dual listing, late 1995, early 1996, and really, put his stamp on the business. So these industry captains had been hugely informed by that period that you talk about, the post-war period, especially the 70s and 80s, 90s, the ups and downs of the commodities cycle, but that need to get effective engagement with communities to really start to lean into the increasing environmental issues that the industry faced, and we had a really important connection at the time around growing the business. So not just our social license, but actually, they were growing the business through M&A, both organically and inorganically. And in the 70s, the group of companies had built 3 new mines around the world, all of them from discovery through construction. In the 80s, 4, in the 90s, 7, and the early 2000s, first decade 2000s, 3 more greenfield mines. So it was also an enormous period of organic growth, but where every single one of those mining operations, you had to get everything right. You were engaging with all of the stakeholders, governments, communities, etc. And so I think what that also did is it meant not only were the most senior leaders of the company really well, vested in the requirements of getting these issues, these sustainable development issues right, so were all of the many of the operational leaders in the business. Let me tested.
Let me cut in on there, because we can look back now with hindsight and say, well, yeah, it was bleeding obvious, but it was really quite pivotal, wasn't it? I mean, here we had an industry that was being threatened, literally threatened by so many communities and NGOs and civil society that was saying your environmental and social stewardship is terrible. Your regard for the people, the circumstances, your impact is not great. And you mentioned Robert Wilson. Sir Robert Wilson, he was one of the architects of the then Mining Minerals Sustainable Development Project, which went right around the world. It resulted in the formation of the International Council of Mining and Metals. It was the industry's epiphany on sustainable development. but there was a lot of pushback, wasn't there? I mean, this was an industry that was conservative. This was an industry that was logical, linear, and rational in its thinking. This was an industry that had just had a massive confrontation. So you did have tension, didn't you, between what was going on in the corporate and the headline levels and the companies wanting to change, but yet we still have the silent operations. We still have the conservative, the pushback. We didn't have the skills, our people skills, and yet Rio Tinto led that. It was a key point of differentiation in how you went. So when you can talk about it now, it's almost clinical. And yet my view coming into the industry in 2002, I found an industry that was just under siege on every front, but there were key companies, and Rio Tinto was a leader, was a vanguard in how you do that. So you talked about community engagement, empathy, community engagement. That was a critical ingredient. How did you turn a company as big as Rio Tinto? How did they do that in getting the community engagement, getting people to understand that trust is as much of value as any other ingredient?
Well, I think it was for exactly those reasons that you said. You know, the industry was under assault. What I think became very clear is the old federated style of running the business was just not effective, that we needed to take a much more global, joined up view. We needed to, you know, entrust our operational leaders more to be able to handle these things, but, you know, recognizing that we needed to build trust with those stakeholders, which clearly said that we needed a plan, we needed a strategy, and it needed to be visionary. So the narrative was based on the history of the industry, but we had these emergent trends that were driving that change. So in the heads and minds of Leon Davis, as you said, Sir Bob, Lee Clifford, it was clear to them that change was essential. You know, it was an existential crisis. I think, and I often talk about Rio Tinto's turning point for safety as one of a key analog or analogy for us. 1998, we had a fatality. 10 miners were killed in a tragedy in an underground talc mine in Austria. And really, that was the point where, you know, the decision was taken, you know, at HQ that this can never happen again. We are going to change this company and this industry fundamentally in terms of safety. And, you know, and having been there at the time, I know exactly, you know, how full on the company got behind that change. So 147-year-old company, as we sit here today, the last 2 years, the company has been fatality-free. Those are the first 2 fatality-free years in the company's history. But what I know is that this day was always coming. It was relentless, that culture of safety first embedded in the DNA of the organization. Then the same thing in those early 2000s, safety first, and we have to do the right things in our communities and with our stakeholders. And we saw that. We saw great work being done. You know, at that time, you know, we started with the view of sort of the triple bottom line. We went to net positive impact, and then now today to that sort of framing of sustainable development. But it's very clear that we just had to get these things right. We had to be much more effective. And as you said, Sir Bob was pivotal in the formation of the ICMM, which today has 27 of the world's largest mining houses, resource houses, as members.
You work pretty closely with some leaders, Harvey and others in the Rio Tinto group. You laid a path for the rest of the industry. Mostly the industry has a tendency to want to be first to be second, but Rio Tinto was so far out in front on Indigenous relations and community engagement. I was terribly impressed, and I worked with Bruce and a lot of others in that sphere in ensuring that we could get to a point of understanding what a dialogue was all about, a mutually beneficial relationship. So when I left, we had 600 odd land use agreements, none of which contested native title. So we were liaising and working with Indigenous groups, and I got to tell you, firsthand, Rio Tinto informed so much of my thinking on that area, along with Melanie Stutzel, who was my director at the time. So what happened with Juukan Gorges? How can a company that was so far out in front get that kind of development?
I think, firstly, Mitch, what I would say is Jukan clearly is a tragedy, and an enormous mistake, and should never have happened. But if Jukan hadn't happened this year, you and I would be having a very different conversation about Rio Tinto's leadership in this area. So I think it's important that we don't define, all of the things that go on in Rio Tinto by this one tragic event. I think the other thing is that, during the China-led boom, the industry, the company, Rio Tinto, grew enormously. And you grow a business, iron ore in this case, by more than 300%, 340, 350%. And, is everything going to keep up with that growth? So technically, yes, the company was able to achieve it, but from clearly in terms of internal systems and processes, because of the size and scale of those businesses, you try to codify as much as you can in your systems and processes. Clearly, what's happened here is we've ended up with an issue where we probably became overly transactional, and there were clearly breakdowns in communications, and those need to be fixed, and I know those will be fixed. But also, I just want to say that across the rest of the company on a daily basis, really great work is being done. And we talk about my history and exploration and evaluation, having led the global exploration group. You mentioned Bruce Harvey's name here, who came out of the exploration group. We have people there doing first contact every day of the week. And they do great work. Now, clearly, what's happened is, Rio Tinto has lost a degree of trust in terms of communities, and they're going to have to get that back. Trust is an asset, and it's something that you work incredibly hard to get, but it disappears extraordinarily quickly when you don't, when you don't meet the aspirations of all your stakeholders. I've no doubt that the company will address this issue. As I said, Jukan of itself is an absolute tragedy. But the key is you've got to have deep and meaningful dialogue with all of your key stakeholders. As I would say to a lot of people, the soft issues of old are absolutely the hard issues of today. The technical piece, the technology piece is simple compared to the people and cultural pieces that we need to work through in order to make a modern, trusted resources house, be that effective partner and do all of those things that you said. The companies need to be profitable through the cycle, so they must focus on costs. That's a given, but it's not at any cost, and I think that's the key. And we just need to make sure that we put our values right at the center, of our business.
We're getting close to the end here. Can I just flesh that out a bit with you? I was often told that the industry was judged by its lowest common denominator. I don't agree with that. I found that there were actually companies of choice within communities, within governments, companies that were actually doing it well. You talked about social and environmental parts of the Sustainable Development Platform as being soft issues. A lot of people interpret that as being almost a derogation, or almost a pejorative, almost a downgrading. But you made the key point, and that is you've got to get those integrated within the three-pillar platform: economic, social, environmental. Those two platforms are different. Do you think the industry has essentially downgraded the quote soft issues to discretionary expenditure, that they're not paying as much attention, that they're looking for the next upswing in the cycle to be the salvation of the industry's continuing progressive development? Do you think the industry is still getting lost in the logic of its own argument by telling everybody how important and how vital it is, and yet it's the doing, it's the showing, it's not the telling?
Look, no, I mean, I don't think that's the case, Mitch, although it might look like that from the outside. I simply think, like all big, complex businesses, you will have challenges that you face that become the emergent theme of a moment in time. And coming off the back of the China-led boom, there was no doubt that companies were needing to get their cost base back in order for, if you want to call it that, going back to sort of the normal commodities cycle. So I think, I don't think that's the case. But what it does mean is that these issues of community, effective community, stakeholder issues, the UN sustainable development goals need to become those priorities again for the companies, as well as you said at the beginning. We need to digitize our businesses. We need to take our businesses forward. We need to describe what that future is going to look like. We need to deal with our legacies, our tailings has been a very hot topic in the last few years. There are lots of big issues out there. The companies simply just have to get them all right. And I think they are rolling up their sleeves to do this, Mitch.
We've got about a minute left. This has been fascinating. I think we could spend a lot longer. We are so fortunate to have had you in the industry and so fortunate to hear your experiences and to tell us. You can't be lost to us. What are you going to do next?
That's a good question. So look, I am contemplating a portfolio career, looking at some board and advisory roles. I certainly, don't intend to leave the industry. This is in my blood and DNA. But I do want to give back to the industry. So it's important that I find the right way to do that, Mitch.
Well, I think the industry ought to be giving back to you, Steve McIntosh. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute delight working with you and a real privilege to have you on this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mitch.